Like many towns in the Black Forest that were developed during the Middle Ages, mine has struggled a little bit with adapting to modernity. And roads that accommodate 21st century vehicles are perhaps the most obvious example. Tight turns, sidewalk parking, and well, this funny situation.
Yes, Ashton in the making of this film has ran into a curb.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, yeah, and the tire.
Driving in Germany and many other countries around Europe is uniquely different from driving in the United States, where even quiet residential streets are wide enough to land an airplane. No, seriously, you can land an airplane here. But while driving in the United States is arguably more comfortable, I want to give you a few reasons why maybe it shouldn't be. So, let's take a look. So what do I mean when I talk about a wide street? I mean, that definition is a little bit subjective, right? There isn't one particular standard for what makes a narrow street narrow and a wide street wide. And most of the time, the size of our streets are dictated by both federal and municipal regulations, so there's going to be variability from one city to the next. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of European examples of wide boulevards too. But on the whole, what we do know is that US cities, in contrast to their international counterparts, dedicate a relatively greater proportion of land area to streets. A typical street in modern France or Germany, for example, is around 20 feet wide. But in the United States, streets are required in many cities to be between 50 and 60 feet. Seriously, according to a recent study out of the University of California, Los Angeles, residential street right-of-ways in the urbanized portion of these counties averaged 55 feet wide. That's right, I'm not talking about Main Street boulevards or business loops. I'm talking about residential streets that are over double the width of their European counterparts. So what gives? No, seriously, why is it that city planners and developers in the United States seem to supersize their streets much greater than the required minimum of 16 feet wide? Well, the obvious and easy answer is car-centric cities, but to be honest, I don't think that tells the whole story. Yes, of course, the majority of suburban America was developed in tandem with the expansion of automobile travel. But pre-automobile U.S. cities were already building wider roads. Some U.S. cities with prominent agricultural industries, such as Salt Lake City, Utah, and Livermore, California, created wide streets to allow horse and oxen-drawn wagons to turn around. And in Europe, many city planners had already noticed a causal link between street size and disease. Early industrial European towns and cities were overcrowded, polluted, and quite frankly, unsanitary. This led to large projects across Europe to demolish slums and widen streets in order to reduce crowding and allow for better ventilation. So, although I do think there are a lot of drawbacks that make these extra wide roads wholly unnecessary and quite frankly a little bit dangerous, but I'll get to more of that in a little bit later, I don't want to paint the entire city planning industry in the US in a bad light. I think at the time, they were working with the best information that they had available to them. For example, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, US street widths were actually planned using experts with scientific reasoning rather than tradition. The prevailing thought was that wider streets were more beautiful, easier to drive down, and would allow for easier access to utilities as cities expanded. And this rationale produced the use of standards, applying practices somewhat uniformly across different situations. And yeah, fast forward to today, street widths are normally dictated by subdivision codes and local street design manuals. In Dallas County and the city of Dallas, for example, they specify a 50-foot right-of-way as the minimum for all residential streets. In Maricopa County, the city of Phoenix, Arizona, nearly 2/3 of residential streets are precisely 50 feet wide, as specified in local development standards and standard design guidelines. In Cook County, the city of Chicago mandates a 66-foot right-of-way, a historical anomaly that's based on the 66-foot length of a surveyor's chain. However, wide streets are not just historical artifact. They are still mandated by subdivision codes today. But the thing is, big roads also can cause big problems. And I think it's time we got into exactly just why that is. And again, why the rock? Okay, must be extremely important if... I'll be blunt. Wide roads are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and expensive to repair. But a little bit of a disclaimer here. There are a lot of variables when it comes to calculating the cost of road building. Location, terrain, type of construction, number of lanes, lane widths, surface durability, and the number of bridges, just to name a few. But in general, it costs a heck of a lot more to build a completely new road than to repair an existing road or to add new lanes to that existing infrastructure. And in general, it costs more to build those new roads and new infrastructure in urban areas rather than rural ones. And as you might expect, it costs more to build in mountainous areas than on stable, flat land. But nonetheless, here are the daunting numbers. According to the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, constructing a 2-lane undivided road in a rural locale will set you back somewhere between $2 and $3 million per mile. In urban areas, that number jumps to $3 to $5 million. And if you want wider roads, the costs understandably go up. For the production of a 4-lane highway, the cost per mile will run between $4 and $6 million and between $8 to $10 million in urban areas. As I mentioned, it is much less expensive to maintain existing roadways. To mill and resurface a 4-lane road, it costs an average of $1.25 million per mile. And to replace the 1.5-inch asphalt on a 2-lane residential street is roughly just around $250,000 per mile. But I don't want to trivialize those numbers because that is still a ton of money that we are spending on supersized streets. And this is compounded by the fact that in the United States, we're actually building far more roads than we even have the money or the time to maintain and repair. Between 2009 and 2017, the full public road network has grown by over 223,000 miles. Enough to drive across the U.S. 83 times. And the $5 billion per year required to maintain just those lane miles added between 2009 and 2017 is more than Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas receive in federal highway appropriations each year. But things are actually quite a bit different here in Germany, a country where they not only invest in their current road network, $22 billion last year alone, and another $141.6 billion earmarked for the structural maintenance of the existing networks until 2030, by the way, but also a lot of research and development money into figure out how to make roads better. There was a funny quote by Thomas Dean, the former executive director of the Transportation Research Board, who said, pretty unironically, that, quote, for many years, the Department of Agriculture spent more dollars researching dog food than the Department of Transportation did on highways. And it's true. Compared to the USA, European countries like Germany spent routinely 20 times as much per capita on R&D. Plus, let's not forget the fact that Germany is home to Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, and Porsche. So it's not surprising that the automotive industry thus demands the need-based state investment in maintaining and extending the road network. And those R&D euros spent here in Germany have all pretty much come to the same conclusion. Bigger isn't necessarily better. In Germany, unlike the United States, municipal road departments award contracts for road work to independent companies based on the quality of their work and the guarantee that their work will last for a long time, rather than outsourcing the work to companies who offer the municipality the lowest price. And I also find that there's actually a substantial difference in how that road maintenance is actually carried out. In the USA, the federal government has, in a very real way, encouraged neglect by subsidizing new construction or major restructuring at 90 cents to the dollar, but awarding little to no subsidies for maintenance work. So the majority of repairs on those suburban streets in the United States has to come from funding from the municipality itself, which, quite frankly, most of the time, it doesn't have, nor does it have the staff or equipment to even conduct that road maintenance in the first place. So a lot of the time in the United States, even on major highways, you see mile after mile of slap and dash patch jobs like this. Now, a second, but often overlooked reason for those smaller roads here in Germany is that wide roads take up more available land space. Land space that can be used for other things, like housing, for example. Developed building land prices in Germany are roughly 10 times more expensive than the United States, costing an average of 236 euros per square meter as of 2022. So purely from a financial perspective, if you're building a new neighborhood, you probably want to spend the least amount of land possible to build roads so that you can maximize your profits by having land to build houses, for example. Building a house with a yard like this in Freiburg would be sickeningly expensive. But we should also think about this from the opposite end of that equation, because the more land that a developer has to spend on roads, the more they have to probably increase land prices in order to compensate. So from this perspective, it's curious to me that even though land prices are cheaper in the US, the amount of land that they're paying for roads doesn't make more people sick to their stomach. Street space in the US is both underused and unpriced, whereas residential and commercial rents and sale prices make many metropolitan regions increasingly unaffordable. Remember, wide streets are often not a choice developers make, rather a constraint imposed by planners through subdivision standards. So residents can normally make trade-offs to choose a smaller yard or maybe a slightly smaller home in exchange for other amenities or even a lower price. But a buyer cannot choose to make a smaller street. Consider this. One landmark study indicated that in Santa Clara, California, narrowing residential streets from their present widths of 60 feet to the post-2000 average width of 46 feet would have saved $21,000 per residential unit. And a further narrowing to the practical minimum of 16 feet would have saved over $100,000 per unit. Something to think about for sure, especially because in residential Germany, for example, we also see things like yield streets, which are used to keep streets smaller and increase that buildable land area for housing. A yield roadway is designed to serve pedestrians, bicyclists, and motor vehicle traffic in the same slow-speed travel area. Yield roadways serve bidirectional motor vehicle traffic without lane markings in the roadway travel area. Like you see here, these yield streets are designed with narrow road dimensions to prioritize local access and community livability. In my neighborhood, they're 6 meters wide, just shy of 20 feet. If no one is parked on the street, it's wide enough to accommodate 2 cars passing comfortably. But if there is street-side parking, it's only typically allowed in one direction, and cars yield to oncoming traffic on that side. Okay. Thank you. Now, of course, this also has a ripple effect on the users of that residential street as well. Namely, they aren't usually as likely to use a car on it. Big, wide roads both encourage and necessitate driving because it physically pushes destinations further apart. Big roads need big setbacks in order for them to not be abhorrently dangerous and loud. But that also means that walking or riding your bicycle from point A to point B, even with appropriate infrastructure, becomes more strenuous and therefore less accessible to the young, the old, and the disabled. And I've talked about this before, but independence and self-reliance are so important at every stage of life. Of course, for the youngest in our communities, safer roads mean that kids are able to walk and ride their bikes more safely and for greater distances, allowing them to feel, more independent, which is so important. But if you also think about this at the end of someone's life, being able to not have to have a car, to be able to go do errands by bicycle or walking, even if you can no longer safely operate a motor vehicle, means that, one, you're probably able to live more independently longer, but also getting outside and getting that exercise means that you live more healthier years not just longer lifespans, which is so important. Now, my next point has been covered very well by S𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗢, and I encourage you to check out his video if you haven't done so already. But what he shares is that wide roads also encourage vehicular speeding by creating a visually open environment. In other words, the more narrow the road, the more human behavior is predispositioned to the restricted field of view by intrinsically lowering our speed and being more careful. But I would actually like to build off of his video by talking about that relationship between road size and speeding by giving some examples about what Germany versus the United States actually does about it. Now, for sure, many drivers admit to speeding in residential areas. Maybe they're running late and wanting to make up for lost time, being unaware of the speed limit and trying to keep up with the other traffic. But increasingly, studies show that the most important factor in determining speed is the driver's perception of the road environment and of what speed is safe to drive. It's not the posted speed limit. It's a visual, subjective calculation that you're making when you're weighing the pros and cons of the speed of your vehicle. And research shows an increase in the average speed as streets widen, about 4 miles an hour between the narrowest and the widest residential streets. And while that 4 miles an hour might not necessarily be the Fast and the Furious, the impact's force on the human body is more than 1/3 greater at 35 miles an hour than at 30 miles an hour. Each 1 mile per hour reduction in average speed translates roughly to a 5% reduction in vehicle crashes. So you would think that with this information that streets would be getting narrower in order to be more safe. But that's not what's happening in the United States. Reports have shown it's actually common practice for American cities to make developers widen a street when they put up a new building. The thinking is that development creates car trips that must be accommodated with more asphalt, which, to be honest, is kind of like blaming Disneyland for increased air travel and then forcing the theme parks to expand runways whenever it adds attractions. But surprise, surprise, here in Germany, they've actually introduced new federal regulations to decrease road sizes. Like I mentioned before, due to the mostly very low traffic load, local roads are only so narrow that two vehicles can only pass each other at a moderate speed. And the narrow roadway does not allow the marking of two separate lanes by center marking. Encounters therefore require increased attention. But to dampen speeds even further, new local roads are now going to be visually narrowed by two guidelines applied laterally at constant distance from the edge. According to the Federal Highway Research Institute, this moving of the marking away from the edge of the lane both protects the road user from leaving the lane and prevents premature soiling of the markings and protects the edges of the roads from damage. At the same time, however, the lateral guidelines require increased attention in the event of an encounter with other vehicles. And if you have a newer car like mine with lane departure alerts, your car also gives you an audio warning to keep you alert and at increased attention in such a situation. And last but not least, I do think that wide roads take away somewhat from the beauty of our cities, not only creating asphalt landscapes, but also making cities less human-centric in their design. I mean, come on, I think we can all objectively agree that this is really ugly, and it pretty well delineates that roads are for cars, not people, even in neighborhoods where kids play and adults hang around outside. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I was a kid who grew up in the Midwest, and even in my residential neighborhood where we had a speed limit posted of 30 miles an hour, I never played in the street. I never rode my bicycle in the street. I always stayed on the sidewalk because it was just seen as far too dangerous. Again, even in a very small residential setting. And here's another example where my in-laws currently live in Overland Park, Kansas. Well, hey, check out that awesome bike lane. I would still bet a significant amount of money that the overwhelming majority of families in this neighborhood would shudder at the idea that their children would play on the street in front of their house. And that's one of the big differences between German and American neighborhoods. It's the degree of walkability. Many people mistake walkability to mean slapping on a set of sidewalks to 4-lane roads that will make the roads safer for people that want to walk. But the thing is, that doesn't actually encourage walking. You could even have great public transportation system, but you're still gonna drive if you have to cross over 5 4-lane roads just to get to your destination in an environment that was clearly built for the automobile. If you want to encourage people to walk, to play outside, to gather outside, then you need to build the environment for people, not automobiles. And the ripple effect that this human-centric design has on the environment is palpable too. Narrow roads use less pavement, and less pavement means that the effects of stormwater runoff aren't nearly as severe. Urban roads, sidewalks, and parking lots make up 2/3 of the total impervious cover in urban environments. And a reduction in width from 36 feet to 26 feet represents a nearly 30% reduction in impervious surface, which translates directly to reductions in stormwater discharge. Moreover, if developers can use the space they save for additional stormwater controls, such as grassed swales or bioretention systems, they can dramatically reduce stormwater discharge and roadway pollutants. Plus, hey, this looks so much nicer. Wouldn't you agree? And here's the thing, guys. I don't think every road should be narrow because, to be honest, narrow roads are a little bit of a pain in the rear to drive on. But I do think that we should be making a better effort to scale our road sizes to not only fit the speed of traffic that we desire, but also to create spaces that are friendlier, safer, and put people first. I would wager that most people appreciate living on a quiet street. Even if you like the idea of having shops, restaurants, and other amenities within a 5-minute walk, chances are you still want the place you live to be relatively quiet and private. Building local streets that are inconvenient to drive on tends to work quite well at accomplishing this because it deters most traffic away from local streets. Garbage trucks, delivery vans, construction vehicles, and emergency vehicles can still come through as needed, as well as the cars of people that actually live in that area. But you would avoid driving through unless you absolutely had to because it's so slow. And yet, the overall impact that this has on your driving is actually pretty minimal if you think about it. We usually only spend just the very little bit of our overall driving time on those residential streets, maybe the very beginning and the very end, where it's 10 kilometers an hour. After that, you can, of course, increase your speed on those main thoroughfares through town. But those narrow, slower streets do require us to be more attentive. And there's probably a lesson in there for me today, as I'm probably going to have to replace an expensive rim in our car after today's little excursion. But yeah, there was a good lesson to be learned there for myself. But I would love to hear from you down in the comments below, especially if you've done some driving on both sides of the Atlantic. How do you feel that wider streets impact your perception of your driving environment? And do you think that narrow roads in general are a good thing? Or maybe a little bit too much of a pain in the rear when you drive? Yeah, let me know what you think down below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss! We picked a rural road that doesn't usually get a lot of traffic. Something in the road? No, there was something in the road. Over. Unless that was the GoPro that just fell off, which could have been.
Es ist okay.
Okay, wir haben heute Glück, so. Danke.
And again, like, why the rock? I don't. It must be extremely important if. I don't. Okay, alright. Okay. I don't think I'm straight is the problem. Dedicates a relative. I think he like shifted right as he went past me too.
It's actually gonna be really funny footage. No GoPro was harmed in the making of this film.
All right.